Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Landrum, and today I will be giving you a summary about the podcast, What Twins Can Tell Us About Who We Are. The podcast was about a psychologist named Nancy Siegel who tells a story about two women who gave birth to twins in the country of Bogota. Unfortunately, one of the twins from each set was switched at birth. One set of the twins was from a city, and the other set of twins were from a remote area that was very rural and not really developed. Later in life, the twins were reunited with one another and were able to see how much they had in common with each other. All the brothers still stay in touch and all feel they are gaining a brother even though they grew up all apart. I chose to do a presentation about this topic because the study of twins has always been very fascinating to me. I have two sets of twins in my family on my dad's side, and my significant other has twin sisters. I think learning about human development is fascinating in itself, but to learn about how an embryo can split and multiply is very fascinating to me. I also thought this podcast was very interesting because it described a story about twins that grew up apart, basically, and how the environment can have an impact on who we are, even though genetics also plays a part on about who we are. New and old ideas. I was surprised to learn that many times twins who are identical or fraternal act very different and have very different characteristics. I have always thought of twins being very similar in the way they act or think, but listening to this podcast made me see and feel very differently. One of the twins, named Carlos, from the set of fraternal twins, was very outspoken, while the other one was very reserved. After listening to the podcast, I think differently about how twins operate and their brain development. I think learning about twins and how they can be so different is essential to my career of wanting to be an educator, because teachers have to know how to treat their twin students differently, even though they come from the same family and may look identical. Lingering questions that I had while watching the podcast. The one question I have after listening to the podcast is, did the SES, or the socioeconomic status of the twins whose mother came from lower income, have an effect on their brain development? I think the podcast did not address this question because the talk about SES, or socioeconomic status, and brain development seems to be something that is more prevalent or being more talked about now. I think learning about brain development and the resources the family has to support their families may have an effect on the growth for children. And I also think the resources that a pregnant mother has a direct effect on brain development for a child. According to the American Psychological Association, they found that both parental educational attainment and family income accounted for differences in the surface area or size of the nooks and crannies of the cerebral cortex. These associations were found across much of the brain, but were particularly pronounced in areas that support language and self-regulation. Two of the very skills that have been repeatedly documented to show large differences along socioeconomic lines. Also, the American Psychological Association, or APA.org, is a reputable source because it is read and referred by psychologists, academic administrators, journalists, and policymakers in Congress and federal science agencies. The findings that I found from the APA.org helped me answer my question from the podcast, because the website states the differences in family income were associated with differences in brain structure for families that have severe disadvantages. These disadvantages can include disparities such as nutrition, housing and neighborhood quality, parenting styles, family stress, and the education of the family. In conclusion, I plan to be a teacher, and I think this podcast helped me understand that all of us have genetic connections to our families, but also learn environmental factors from the others that we surround ourselves with. The podcast showed me how the brothers had genetic connections with one another, even though they spent much of their lives apart, but also shared many environmental connections with the brother they grew up with, even though there was no genetic connection with that brother.